cords up. Good evening. Delighted to welcome you all to the Royal Irish Academy for tonight's discourse entitled The Neuroscience of Resilience, Building Brains to Withstand Life. This is the fifth discourse in our 2025-26 series, which examines resilience from various different perspectives with distinguished speakers who are experts in various fields. My name is Daniel Carey. I am the recently appointed president of the Royal Irish Academy, the 59th, in fact. I also want to welcome our treasurer, Mary Kelly, who is here this evening, and also our executive director, Lynn Scarf. Our secretary, Linda Hogan, MRIA, who oversees the management of the Discourse Series, is unfortunately unavailable this evening. The Academy Discourses are the oldest and most renowned series of talks in Ireland. The first discourses were presented in 1786, in fact. Historically, they were the occasion reserved for the most distinguished academics to first reveal and discuss their work in public. We now record these discourses, and they are available on the Academy's website, and I would encourage you to have a look. Before we begin, we have a little bit of Academy business to attend to. Our last discourse, a panel discussion entitled All Island Infrastructure Resilience, How Prepared Are We?, took place on the 11th of March of 2026, and the minutes were posted online. Since our members did not inform us of any issues with these minutes, I will take these as approved, and I will sign the minute book after this discourse concludes. We're going to now welcome our esteemed speakers for this evening's discourse. George Bonanno is Professor of Clinical Psychology at Columbia University's Teachers College and internationally recognized for his pioneering research on human resilience in the face of loss and potential trauma. He is listed among the top 1% most cited scientists in the world and honored as a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science and received Lifetime Achievement Awards from the Association for Psychological Science, the International Society for Traumatic Stress Studies, and the International Positive Psychology Association. In addition to the books The End of Trauma and The Other Side of Sadness, George has published hundreds of peer-reviewed scientific articles. Our respondent this evening is Professor Ian Robertson, member of the Royal Irish Academy since 2004 and a member of Academia Europaea. Professor Emeritus and Fellow of Trinity College Dublin and T. Boone Pickens Distinguished Chair at the University of Texas at Dallas. Ian was founding director of the Institute of Neuroscience at Trinity College Dublin and the Global Brain Health Institute. In 2024, he was awarded Honorary Doctor of Science and MD degrees by Trinity College Dublin. His 600+ scientific papers on the neuropsychology of attention and neuroplasticity have been cited more than 41,000 times. His most recent popular science book is How Confidence Works. And our rapporteur for this evening, the rapporteur kind of keeps us in order, keeps notes, looked after the affairs, tells us what actually happened, is Dr. Joe McDonough, Chair of the Academy's Life and Health Sciences Committee, and he's going to prepare a short summary report based on the discourse tonight, and it will also be published on our blog site. So finally, to the discourse itself, Professor Bonanno, I hand over to you.
Hello, welcome. Thank you for welcoming me here. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to be in Dublin. I want to tell you about my research of the last 35 years. I will have a lot of slides, and I hope this is interesting to you. I hope this is informative for you. I always begin with this slide. One piece is out of place there. Bad things happen. These are pictures you can get from the web. These are the kind of things that are happening all the time. They're happening right now as we speak somewhere in the world. These are really nasty events. These are things that we're frightened of, things we don't want to happen to us, and they're pretty bad. We call these things traumas, and we call them traumas because they do harm people. However, very interesting scientific fact, the epidemiological research, a large-scale study, survey research has shown that most people will experience at least one of these type of events and often several in the course of their lives. So they're more common than we think they are. which raises questions of what we mean when we call them trauma. It also raises questions about resilience. Now, I'm going to talk about resilience tonight and trauma. Before I do so, I want to tell you a little story. This is what we call this. This is New York City. We call this a garbage truck, a sanitation truck. I don't know what you would call them here, a rubbish lorry, maybe. They're in the US, you know, the trucks are big in the US, and these things are big and they're really heavy duty. When fully loaded, they weigh, I believe that's the correct conversion, 23,000 kilos. They're massive. They have 10 wheels, 5 on each side. They're also arguably dangerous. They go too fast. They go faster than are allowed. They go through red lights. They go through stop signs. They go the wrong way down one-way streets. I've seen all of this myself. They also turn right on a red light. You can do that in many places in the US, but it's illegal in New York City. A particularly onerous example of that happened on December 21st, 2009, 1:30 in the morning. On a very cold night. It was about 20 degrees Fahrenheit, which is, I think, -7 Celsius. And this happened to a guy named Jed. He was working in a very nice upscale restaurant down in Greenwich Village. That's Greenwich Village. He left the restaurant at 1:30 in the morning, walked to the street corner. He waited for the walk signal, the white walk signal. He remembers seeing that shining off the icy pavement, walked into the intersection, and a garbage truck came, made an illegal right turn on a red light very fast, clipped him and pulled him underneath the truck. All 5 wheels ran over his left leg and part of his hip. It was just a horrific accident. I won't tell you any more details than that, but he was screaming wildly on the street. He was bleeding profusely. The first responders came. They told him he would have bled out right then and there if it wasn't so cold. It slowed the flow of blood. That phrase at the bottom, putting a rush on the bus, is what the first responders say when the ambulance is late. The ambulance is the bus, and they were yelling, "Get the ambulance here." 1:30 in the morning in New York City, you can still have a traffic jam. So the ambulance was held up. Eventually, they got him to the hospital. After 6 weeks, they decided to put him in a medically induced coma so he would survive, because they were going to do a lot of reconstruction. 6 weeks of coma, 20 surgeries, 18 infections. When Jed came out, he looked like this. He sometimes draws stares from people because there's a lot of him missing. This is the Columbia University campus where I teach, and became my student for a while, which is how I know him. This is also Jed. As you can see from these photos, some of the photos are missing, they're not popping up, but you can see that he looks like he's a happy man. He looks like he's living a healthy, good life. And he is, I think, by all accounts. This is also Jed. He skied before the accident. He learned how to ski on one leg afterwards. And now what I want to show you now, this is about a 1.5-minute little short movie that the gymnasium, the place where he does exercise, thought his story was interesting. They hired a very nice filmmaker to make this little video about him. Unfortunately, they wanted me in it because I think that was a mistake. Because he was in my lab, they thought, let's do that. And so I think that was an artistic mistake, but they did it anyway. So I'm going to show you this little video, and then we'll get back to Jed.
Megan always told me to remember her cell number. I thought it was strange, but I memorized it anyway. It was December and past midnight. I got a light at the crosswalk. It was cold. Must have my hood up. The ambulance took almost 20 minutes. I was holding the first responder's hand throughout, saying Megan's number over. The transition, a transformation. The accident prompted a shift in direction for me, and I began to think about the psychology of resilience. I'm now working on a PhD in psychology at Columbia, studying under Dr. George Bonanno. George's work centers on trauma, how and why we recover, and theories of resilience. In his lab, we work with people who have recently suffered a loss or bereavement. We're looking for patterns, reasons, and answers. Being healthy and treating my body right was important to me before the accident, and it still is. In this new body, I've had to adapt and forge new ways. Michelle helped immensely with that. She's tough and takes no excuses. I get the same treatment as everyone else. What I've learned and what I'm now studying is that the ability to rebound and heal is the norm. When we're knocked down, we get back up and continue forward. It's in all of us. It's the human condition. Everything I do is not amazing. I'm just human. And this is what we do.
Okay, so that's Jed's story. Now, when we go back to the hospital, when he was coming out of the coma, his family was worried because they were going to bring him out of the coma and a big part of his body would be missing. He'd have the hoses and wires coming out of him. They were worried at how he would react. But for some reason, he already knew. You know, when you're in medically induced coma, information does get in. It's different than an injury-induced coma. So this is the quote from Jed. I had a sense that my leg was really messed up, like on the pavement. I could see it was bad. I was on death's door. So on some level, I already knew. And for whatever reason, I woke up thinking it was already gone. I was not surprised. But what about all the other part, all the rest of the accident? He was conscious through the whole thing until they put him out. So he remembered all he went through, and he had these traumatic memories. Remember just being pummeled with these memories. They kept replaying the accident. These memories had a deep psychological valence, you know, like a sort of a deep traumatic valence. And I thought, oh, wow, I cannot believe I have to go through this. I have to remember, I have to process all this. But then, to his surprise, in just a few days, that stopped. I thought how funny that was, how the salience of those memories, I'm going to take this off if I can. Is that okay? Let me take this off. I thought how funny that was, how the salience of those memories faded, and I no longer had the type of intense reaction to those memories I did when I first woke up. And this confused him. He didn't really understand why. I had burning questions. I was mostly wondering, why wasn't I more messed up? I was really puzzled. You know, if everybody gets PTSD, why was I doing okay? That was my question, really. Why was I doing okay? And we can ask the same question. Why was Jed doing okay? Why would anybody be okay after going through that event? And that's what I want to talk with you about today. I call this the 3 axioms of resilience. First, I'll talk about the fact that resilience to potential trauma, resilience to the kind of experiences Jed went through even, is common. Second, resilience is not really a type. It's not about having the right traits or behaviors, having the certain key traits. Third, resilience does come about through flexible self-regulation, or what I call regulatory flexibility, flexible adaptation. And I'll tell you about that at the end of the talk. First, resilience is common. When I began my career, I began doing this research in 1991. And at the time, it was about 10 years after PTSD was formally created as a diagnosis. And the way people thought about trauma was binary. You either had PTSD or you didn't. There were 2 options. You had one or the other. And that was useful because it helped people, it spurred a lot of research, it helped get the field going, it helped people figure out what was happening, it helped guide treatments. But it's flawed in many ways, and it masked a lot of really important information. You can really see this graphically. So if we have a potentially traumatic event, I don't call events traumatic, I call them potentially traumatic. Potentially traumatic event, we have a continuum of time and a continuum of adjustment from low to high symptoms and distress, or health to poor health. Chronic PTSD or chronic grief or depression or whatever we're looking at after one of these events would look like that. You'd have really high levels of symptoms, some waxing and waning, some variation over time, but otherwise high levels of symptoms if it's chronic for at least a couple of years. Now, everybody else, most people don't develop PTSD, so everybody else is in the only remaining category. It doesn't really have a name. Non-PTSD, non-psychopathology, health, resilience, none of those words capture it. Now, this gets, so we don't know much about those people. The focus was all on PTSD. It gets particularly obvious what the limitation is if we try to look at this graphically. Where are those people that didn't develop PTSD? Where do they live on this graph? People didn't know this. Now, this is what the state of where things were when I began when I began focusing on these questions. And I was particularly interested in this area of the graph, people who go through a potentially traumatic event like the kind Jed went through, and they show really low levels of symptoms or none at all. At the time, that was considered extremely rare. And in many circles, it was considered pathological. There's something wrong with those people. Why are they not showing these kind of symptoms? So I was fascinated by all this. I came to this a little bit out of, I want to say left field. That's a baseball metaphor. I don't know what cricket does or what any sports do, but I came out of nowhere because I didn't know much about this area. So, well, this is fascinating. So I began my research program, not assuming it would last 35 years, trying to understand the variations, the different types of patterns people showed. And we ended up finding prototypical trajectories. That's what we found after a number of tries at this. So this is what it looks like. We do see a chronic trajectory, and that's the prevalence. So there are people showing chronically high symptoms. That's not the PTSD diagnosis. It's not a categorical diagnosis. It's not a categorical factor. That's the mean of a group of people sort of hovering around that mean. Then we found this trajectory, which is still not well understood. Some people show very acute symptoms in the beginning, really high levels of symptom, but then they gradually start getting better. Those are two very different patterns. I'd rather be in the recovery pattern than the chronic pattern, as would almost anybody, but we don't know much about why that is. And it's not been an object of study for very much. And I don't study it because I'm interested in something else. So that's still a big unknown. We see this pattern. People used to think about delayed PTSD is coming out of the blue. We don't see that, but we see this pattern where people are struggling, they're getting by, but then they're gradually getting worse instead of getting better. We do see that pattern. Now, what about this area of the graph? You may know where I'm going with this already. The area of the graph that was assumed to be so rare. When we got large samples and looked and mapped the trajectories, this is where most people were. You see a little bit of a bump there, which is quite normal, and then otherwise a stable trajectory of healthy functioning. We see this pattern over and over, and this is almost always the majority pattern we see. Most people show that pattern. So if there's anything I've done in my career that's worthy at all, it's that we looked. We just looked to see what was in this spot. Here is it's not there yet. Here is a slide with some recent studies. This is actually a little bit out of date now. You can see on the left, the studies with an asterisk have come from my lab. But a lot of other labs have adopted our method and are doing these same kinds of studies now. So they're burgeoning. You can see on the right, the types of events. These are some pretty nasty things here. You have mass shooting, traumatic injury, hurricane. You don't have hurricanes in Ireland. You must have other kinds of natural disasters. You have people dying in bogs. I learned that. So we have combat exposure, all kinds of nasty things, heart attacks. And you can see in all of these studies, the majority showed that resilience pattern. We did a review, I guess this is 8 years ago now. At the time, there were 63 studies that had used this approach, using different kinds of computational modeling, because it is computational, but that didn't matter because people use different kind of computational modelings, different events. And what these studies showed was that on average, that resilience trajectory of hardly any symptomatic reaction, no lasting harm, was around 2/3 of all the people, thousands and thousands of people in these studies. And then the other 1/3 tended to show one of these other patterns, which is not there's some suffering in these other patterns. What about COVID? So at the beginning of COVID, I'm sure you all remember, the beginning of COVID, maybe you might not remember so much. The question I had was, what about these same trajectories? Now at the time, right at the beginning of March 2020, I was in Oslo with my wife, Paulette, who's right here. And we were, I was on sabbatical and I was giving a talk at the University of Oslo. We were on our way to Copenhagen to give a talk there. And we never made it because we were told we had to leave the country immediately. The borders are closing, COVID's getting out of hand, get home to New York. So we did. Right around that time, the Association for Psychological Science asked me to contribute something for the website on resilience during pandemics. So I agreed to do that, but it was a tricky question. We got back to New York in the middle of March. By 1 month later, it was out of control. That graph shows the number of deaths per day in New York City. And you can see, I don't know how well you can see it on the bottom, the graph, the peak just starts going up in the middle of March. By the middle of April, it's at its peak, 800 people a day dying in New York City, hospitals overflowing, et cetera. This is a picture of a mobile refrigerator unit for dead bodies outside of a hospital. There's a hospital near my neighborhood in New York. I would bicycle past it. I'd bicycle past the refrigerator truck filled with dead bodies almost every day because there was nowhere to put the bodies in the hospitals. This is also near where we live. This is Northern Central Park in New York. That's right across the street from Mount Sinai Hospital, and there were no room for the patients in the hospital, so they put up temporary tents in Central Park for the overflow. I'm sure you've seen things like this. We all went through this. I was willing to say at the time, I think we're going to be okay because of all the other studies we've done at the time. And this was actually very unpopular. I was on some international panels with people, and the other mental health experts were saying things like, this is going to be an unprecedented crisis. We don't have the resources to cope with all the psychological problems that will come from this pandemic. So I was willing to say that's not likely to happen. So we didn't have any data yet, though, but within about a year after the pandemic, the data started coming in. This is a study we did in Israel. We had a population sample, a representative sample from Israel, and we found the majority showed low levels of depression and anxiety. This study we did in Poland, again, the majority showed low levels of depression and anxiety. This is a study we did in Hubei province in China, in the People's Republic of China. And if you remember, Hubei is where the city of Wuhan is, and Wuhan was where the pandemic began. During that first year in Wuhan, they had the most severe lockdown, I think, in recorded history in Hubei. We were able to get data on depression, anxiety, and PTSD symptoms from people in that region. And we found, again, the resilience pattern in all three of those measures. The majority showed that low level. A German team headed by Sarah Schaffer, and this is from Klaus Lieb's lab in Mainz, Germany. And they decided to look at these same trajectories during COVID, the trajectories we'd been identifying. This is the figure from their study. In the lower left-hand corner is the figure from the study that I'd done, the one I just showed you, the review where we had looked at 63 studies. These were all done before COVID, and we found that the majority, 66%, showed that resilience pattern. During COVID, they found another 26 studies, a lot of studies. People were at their computers. Scientists were at their computers. Everybody else was at their computers. A lot of research got done during COVID. 26 studies like this. But what they found was that resilience pattern was identified 66%, almost identical, shockingly close. So the prevalence of resilience during COVID was literally the same as it was before COVID. A lot of people, when I present these results, said, what about youth, younger people? They really suffered. We were raising some youth during COVID, and it seemed pretty nasty for them, but the studies show that they also showed resilience around the same level. Here's one of those studies. They had data, this study, they had data for over 2 years, pretty decent sample of kids, and they concluded the mental health of most children and adolescents remained resilient throughout the pandemic. So why is that? Why 2/3, and then why not everybody, and what informs who will be resilient and who not? This is the typical answer. The 5 traits, the 3 traits, the 7 traits. I'm very suspicious when I see such neat numbers. These are fairy tale numbers. 7 dwarves, 3 brothers go off into the woods. It's a little neat and tidy, but it's also wrong. This is not at all true. Now, why would I? Well, first of all, here's my second point, that resilience is not a type, and having certain key traits alone will not make us resilient. Now, why would I say that? one of the main reasons is when we actually measure what correlates with that resilience pattern, we don't find 3, 5, or 7 traits. We find 50, 60, and more. Here's just some of them. These are some of the things, good things that people have. This will go on for a little bit. This is only some of them. I'm particularly proud of this one. So this and more, 50, 60, what do we do with this information? We want to understand who's resilient and who not. What did we do with this information? So many different factors. Does that mean everybody's doing something different? Maybe. Does it mean some people just do a lot of these things? Maybe. But the data don't really bear that out because these things are all of these factors we find are all small effects. Now, statistically, they're small effect size, but in plain language, what that means is each one of these factors that we can identify as correlates of resilience only explains a little tiny bit of who will be resilient and who not. So if you have one of these factors, it increases your odds just a little bit, not much at all. So that's an even harder nut to crack. How do we solve that problem? Quickly, I won't go into detail about this, but one thing we thought maybe we need to do machine learning and try to tease this apart. That was very big at the time. This was before AI was big, which are really the same thing, but now it's AI. We did 3 studies. In one study, we had polygenic scores, genome-wide scores that are normed against a certain outcome. We had 21 different genome-wide scores. In another study, we had people who would come to the emergency department for a traumatic stressor, and we had 70 different biological and psychological variables. In a third study, that was the Hubei study I told you about earlier, and we had 60 variables that were either about the person or about the context in which they lived. When we did these analyses, we did improve prediction some, but it was still variable across studies, and it was still modest. It wasn't as high as we thought it would be, but more important, we never found key variables. We never found some key things that showed up all the time. We weren't finding that. So basically the machine learning approach, as cool as it was to do it, it was fun to do it, it didn't really solve the problem, didn't answer the question. And I call this the resilience paradox. When we think about resilience, if we think of it as a pie, we tend to think that we're going to fill up that pie with nice big slices. These are our favorite things, are 3, 5, or 7 things, and that's going to tell us who's resilient. We can work with that. We can teach people those certain things, and they'll be more resilient. That's idealized because we don't see that. We see something more like this, very small little slices. When we have machine learning, we can measure a lot of these things. We can explain more of that pie, but we still don't often explain as much as half of it even. And the slices get even smaller because they're all good things. So when we put them in a computational model, they overlap so much, the unique contribution gets even smaller. So this is the paradox. We know these correlates, but we still can't predict who will be resilient with much accuracy. More important, we don't know how it works. We don't know what the mechanism is. What are people doing with all this information? What are resilient people? People who are finding a way to resilient. What are they doing? We hadn't, with all of this data, we hadn't been able to solve that problem yet. So I was troubled by this. I thought about this for a long time. And I think now we have a pretty good answer. So in the time I have remaining, which I lost track of completely, I will tell you what I think we know about this. First of all, if we think about this, the different types of situations and the challenges people are confronted with are going to vary greatly. Coping with a hurricane or being killed and put in a bog is different than coping in a terrorist attack or abuse or loss or medical emergency or disease pandemic. And we tend to think traumatic events are all the same. Something causes trauma, well, that's a traumatic event. And something else causes trauma, that's a traumatic event. So they're the same kind of thing. They present the same kind of challenge. It's completely not true. All of these events present very different challenges. We also see that it varies across people. We did a lot of research, for example, after 9/11, people who were in those towers when the planes hit. And what we found was all those people were in those towers. They all had to get out of those towers. They had to take the stairs, hundreds of flights of stairs in some cases, shredded glass, gasoline explosions, so many different stories. People had very different experiences running for their lives when the towers came down. Same event, but very different experiences. And it changes over time. So what happens initially when we're exposed to a violent or life-threatening event, we kind of have a shock reaction, we kind of feel numb, we kind of are confused, then that kind of morphs a little bit, we start having intrusive thoughts, maybe nightmares, we keep thinking about it when we don't want to, then that kind of morphs further, we get hyper aroused, we tend to feel very apprehensive, we worry about what's happened to us. A lot of people now in the general public worry they have PTSD. Everybody knows what PTSD is now. And so when something happens and people have a nightmare, they think, I have PTSD, which is also anxiety producing. And by the way, a lot of these reactions are completely normative. They're adaptive. I won't go into that now, but they're quite adaptive. So situational challenges vary across events, across people, and across time. Second point, every trait and behavior we do, even the things that make us resilient, have costs and benefits and costs. This is one of my favorite points. I could talk about this all day. We see this in nature. We see this in biology. We see it in larger levels. There's no such thing as a perfect adaptation, perfect trait or behavior. Everyone has costs and benefits. One of my favorite examples is the peacock's tail. This is a peacock. You all know what a peacock is. 3 peacocks were living in our neighborhood in Manhattan for a while. They would literally stop traffic sometimes. They'd unfurl that tail and cause a traffic jam. They're quite remarkable, these birds. Now, here's a quote from Charles Darwin, the father of evolutionary theory. When I see a feather in a peacock's tail, whenever I gaze at it, it makes me sick. Now, why would Darwin say that? He spent his entire life looking at animals, comparing them. Why would it be so aggressively nauseated to a peacock's tail? The answer to that is in the date. He said that in 1860. In 1859, he published The Origin of Species. He spent a long time compiling that book. That was his first major tome. He had been writing that book for a long time. He was reluctant to publish it because he knew it was going to cause a firestorm. At that time, the dominant explanation for the diversity of animal species in the Western world was that God did it. That was really what pretty much everyone said, okay, yeah, we'll go with that. And Darwin was saying, well, not really, not so fast. It evolved slowly over time, and we descended from creatures that we think are inferior to us. Darwin knew that was going to be a problem for a lot of people. His wife was highly religious. He was religious. This was going to cause a lot of pain in his life. It was going to cause things like this to happen. Where he was, and he was a member of society. He was a shy man. He was a gentleman. He didn't want to see his face in the paper on a cartoon like that. So why the peacock? The problem is his theory was that traits in animals evolve because they promote survival. They promote survival, the creature's more likely to live. They'll pass it on to their offspring. Those creatures will inherit that trait. He didn't know about genes yet, but he knew there was some way that they could pass on their traits. And then they will be more likely to survive. And then their offspring will be more likely to survive, et cetera, until it becomes a trait for the species. That's how natural selection works, survival of the fittest. That was his proposal. And it's held up very nicely over all these years. Problem is, how do you explain a peacock's tail that way? It doesn't work. That's why it made him sick. The peacock's tail is like a neon sign. Now, if you're going to eat a bird, if you're a predator, this is your bird. It's a big bird. They're really quite large. They have a lot of meat on them. And they have this big tail that you can see over the brush. You can see it in a clearing. It says I'm over here. And the predators also know, missed a slide. Predators also know that they can fly, but not very well. So not only are they easy to find, they can't get away as easy. So why would that evolve as part of the species? It didn't make any sense. This was what troubled Darwin so much. So he had a problem to solve. It took him 12 years to solve the problem. What he did was he introduced a second evolutionary mechanism, survival of the fittest, natural selection, and he introduced a second one. Here's a hint as to what that second mechanism was. Sexual selection. And this is the quote: females, meaning the peahens, have unconsciously, by the continued preference of the most beautiful males, rendered the peacock the most splendid species of living bird. Sexual selection means that in birds, and you see this in some other creatures, the males are the most attractive. The males are colorful. And the females, when they're ready, pick the male based on their, in this case, on their tail, right? So the males are competing for that, for the female with the better tail. And the males with the better tail will pass on their genes, and the tail will get bigger and bigger. It's a great device, you have to admit. I mean, if you ever go in a club or a bar or something, and when you're single, and it cuts out a lot of the in-between stuff. So in order to make this work, though, Darwin introduced his second mechanism. So he built in costs and benefits into evolutionary theory. The benefit is it's more likely to produce mating, pass on the genes that way. The cost is it makes that creature highly susceptible to predation. One more quick example, the cheetah's speed. Cheetahs are beautiful animals. They are the fastest terrestrial mammal on the planet. They can get up to 97 kilometers per hour in 3 seconds. It's incredibly fast. They have teeth and claws, and they eat meat. Now, they seem perfect. That's a perfect creature. You might want to be that creature. Very beneficial body configuration. There's a cost to that kind of speed. Does anybody know what the cost is? Anybody want to guess what the cost is? Energy consumption. Yeah, they don't have stamina because there's so much caloric energy is required. Their metabolism have to get ramped up really high in order to get that fast. They can only do it for about 30 seconds. They're completely exhausted when it's over. And cheetah, who are scavengers, hyenas. Hyenas are scavengers. They will sometimes sneak in, even if a cheetah kills something, the hyenas will sometimes sneak in and take it because they know that the cheetah can't chase them. They don't have any more stamina. And the tracking studies have shown that they actually don't catch most of the creatures they chase because those creatures, they know they don't have to outrun the cheetah. They only have to outrun the cheetah for 30 seconds. So they adopt their own strategies to do that. Now we get back to humans, and we can see costs and benefits in everything humans do as well, because we're animals too. And a good example are coping and emotion regulation behaviors. We tend to think of coping and emotion regulation in good or bad strategies. These are good strategies, these are bad strategies. So the things that we think that have traditionally thought of as bad, like distraction, suppressing emotions, these are kind of avoiding dealing with it. Those are thought to be maladaptive. And they are in some situations, but very good research now has shown that in some situations, they're highly adaptive. Depends on the situation. Same thing when we go to the opposite. The things that have thought to be highly adaptive, like finding meaning, reappraising, reframing it, connecting with other people. These are good things to do when we're struggling, and they're thought to be highly adaptive, but there's good research showing that sometimes they're not effective and sometimes they're even harmful. So put all this together, we have what works in one situation may not be effective or may be even harmful in another situation or in another point in time. And when we look across situations, that's why we have these small effects. The small effects suggested that these things don't really work. What we actually see when we look across situations is they work really well sometimes. Sometimes they don't work at all. They work really poorly or they're more harmful. And sometimes they're kind of in the middle. And that's what a lot of research has shown now. So we have, this is a little bit silly, this example, but things are not always useful. I'm going to skip this, I think. This is a study from the German team again, where they looked at lots of different behaviors, and they actually found, with 50 different studies, they found exactly what I was just saying, that some behaviors were sometimes very positive, sometimes very negative. Okay, what works in one situation may not be as effective or even harmful in another or another point in time. Third point, which I began to talk with, is the first point I began to talk with, is most people show resilience. Therefore, most people must be flexible enough to solve this problem. The resilient people must be working this out somehow. Somehow people who are finding a way to resilience must be solving this problem. In other words, they must work out the right behavior for the right time in the right situation. And that brings me to the third point, which is really flexibility. Resilience comes about through flexible self-regulation, or what I call regulatory flexibility. Regulatory flexibility was a poor choice of words on my part, because if you Google it, you get flexibility about meeting regulations. So I wish I could take that one back. The first study we did like this was after 9/11. It was actually a 9/11 study. We'd already planned this. We had an experiment where we showed people very disturbing images, and there was another person in the room or in another room watching on a monitor. They were told to be as expressive as possible without saying anything so they can guess what you're feeling. In another condition, they just viewed the stimuli normally, the pictures normally. And in a third condition, they were told to conceal their emotions as best they can. Just don't show any emotion. We randomized all that. What we found was that the people who did best 2 years later after 9/11, we followed them over time, or the people who could do both those things. People could express a lot of emotion, and the people who could suppress a lot of emotion. The people who could do both of those things were the healthiest. People who could do one of those things without the other were not necessarily any better off than anybody else. So being very expressive isn't adaptive if you can't also turn it off. We continued to do that kind of research for a number of years. We eventually put it together in a model in 2013 with work other people were doing, which we call regulatory flexibility. I want to tell you about that really quickly, and then I will stop. I have no idea what time it is. Sorry. Okay. What does that mean? I don't know how much time that leaves me. Oh, okay, I have a few minutes. All right. Okay. We've evolved this idea now, but the key part is what we call now the flexibility sequence. These are 3 skills, 3 things people do in sequence that help them work out how to respond to a major stressor. And it turns out that most people can actually do this. This is stuff we learn as we develop, as we grow up. We're taught this from our families, from our parents, our teachers, our friends. First step, we call this context sensitivity. It's about asking yourself, what's really happening right now? And that, we may be thinking we're traumatized, but that's a big road to hoe. But there's something happening in the moment. Maybe I'm not sleeping well. I'm feeling really anxious. I don't want to go to this place because that's what happened. I don't want to talk to these people. I don't want to get in that car because I know what happens when I'm in the car. Our minds are trying to work all this out, and we're behaving rather oddly. We're struggling with that. And so what we need to do at this point is narrow down, what is it right now that's really bothering me, so we can actually address that problem. That's what we do at this stage. What's happening now, and what do I need to do? So we focus on that. Okay, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to find a way to sleep better. I'm going to find a way to get in that car and drive. I'm going to find a way to control my anxiety right now. We go to the next step. We call this repertoire, where we actually then choose a strategy. We do something to try to address that problem. But here the question is a little bit different. Not just what do I need to do, what am I able to do? Because we have a repertoire of tools. Every person has a different collection of all those things I showed you earlier, those 60 things. People have different skills, different traits, different behaviors, and we choose from our repertoire, things we know we can do, and we choose one. That's very important. So here's a kind of a, hope this is an okay example. We have a house now in the outside of the city, and I do a lot of stuff with wood, so I chose this example. We have a board, and we want to cut that board right where that line is. We want a pretty nice cut there. So we have 2 saws, a hand saw and a chainsaw. The hand saw works very well for cutting that line accurately. That's what it's designed for. The chainsaw will also cut that line. You'll do it very fast, but a chainsaw it's a very wide blade. It's a powerful tool. It's hard to control it, and it will cut through that wood very fast and do a kind of a sloppy job. So it's not the best saw. However, if you want to cut through a large log, I know you have large logs in Belfast. I'm sorry, in Dublin. Do you have chainsaws? You must have chainsaws. And it does a very good job cutting these large logs. You can also cut a log with a handsaw, but it's not really designed for that. It takes a long time. Your arm will be exhausted, and the blade will heat up because it's a thin piece of metal and will heat up and get stuck in the wood. So we have 2 saws, 2 different tools. two different tasks, one of those is a better choice. So that's what we do in this repertoire stage. From what I have, what do I choose to try to address this problem? Then we go to this very important third stage we call feedback. And this is so simple. This is another one of those things. It was not, once we thought about this, we kind of did one of those Homer Simpson things like, why didn't I think of this before? We simply ask ourselves, did it work? There's almost no research on this. In the field of emotion regulation, all this coping literature, there's almost no research where people ask them about what happens when people ask themselves, did it work? And so we did some of the first research on this. It's a very important stage. And it turns out in psychotherapy, a lot of people, once I started doing this research, therapists would tell me, this is where my patients, my clients stumble. Because they have their go-to strategy. They say, I exercise, or I like to cook, or I like to talk to my friends, and I did that, and it didn't work. And I don't know, I can't cope with this. I can't do it. And that goes hand in hand with that myth that resilience is this trait. And you either have it or you don't. And so there's this myth that you try something, if it doesn't work, that means you're not resilient. And the simple communication is no, you try something else. And that's how people actually cope when we look at this empirically. So you try a different strategy, go back to your toolbox, you try something else. If that doesn't work, you monitor it again, you go back and you try another strategy. It turns out, on average, people use many coping strategies. When we actually do this in daily life with beeper studies or texting people, we find out that people use a lot of strategies any given moment for a difficult event. Eventually, we might decide, I've tried a lot of different things and it's not working. I need to go back to the beginning and rethink the problem. Maybe I'm focusing too broad. I'm not focusing on the right problem. And that's what people do. For really big events, we go through these many times because as the event changes over time. So people will cycle through this many times. This is relatively simple. It took a long time and a lot of research and a lot of government money to figure this out, but we did eventually, and we're still working on it, trying to fine tune it. Now, if we're arguing that people are resilient or find a way to resilience because of this flexibility, that we should find then that most people can do this flexibility stuff. And that's exactly what we found. We did a couple big studies, recently with a fair amount of subjects, and we found the majority had at least moderate skill in all three of those components. Okay. Resilience to potential trauma is common. I told you that typically it's the majority across all these studies. Resilience is not a type. Having certain key traits will not make us resilient. Many factors linked with resilience. There are many factors linked with resilience, and the effects are very small. And I had argued that resilience comes about through flexible self-regulation, and that is essentially enacting the right behavior strategy for the right situation at the right time and correcting as needed. That's the gist of it. I want to thank the people that have funded me throughout my career. I've been very lucky to be funded. Funding has taken a little bit of a turn in the US in the last couple of years. Couldn't figure out why. And so it's a little harder now. But we're doing what we can. This is my most recent book, which summarizes a lot of this material. And I wanted to just, with no shame at all, show you the book. And I want to thank you very much for your time. I hope that says what I think it says.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Professor Bonanno, for that fantastic presentation. I had an insight during it of I was once in Trinity College. They have these lavish academic gowns like are present here. And there's a selection advantage wearing the gown in Trinity College, but I made the mistake once of walking outside of Trinity College wearing my dinner suit and my gown, and the abuse I received at the hands of the ordinary citizens of Dublin meant I realized so well now the costs and benefits of these selection pressures. I really appreciated your talk very much indeed. And what I'd like to do is to just bring there's a vast amount of unexplained variance, the context, the feedback, the different horses for courses. And I want to talk about three different domains that might unpick a little bit of that variance. So the first one is in the UK, and I believe in some other countries, about 20 years ago, there was a very worthy movement to try and deal with post-accident traumas. And so there's a number of psychologists who actually ended up wearing high visibility vests and going out in the wake of accidents and providing psychological support soon after accidents. It's called debriefing, psychological debriefing. And this was considered to be self-evidently a good thing to try and prevent the development of trauma. But then, as you know, psychologists love helping people, and these ruthless medics sometimes are skeptical about psychological things. So this group of medics in Oxford decided to do a randomized controlled trial of this psychological debriefing in Oxford. And so they took people who were injured badly enough, probably very few of them as badly as Jed, but they took people who were injured badly enough to be admitted to hospital for physical injury. And the aim of the debriefing was quite comprehensive. It was to promote emotional and cognitive processes leading to resolution of the trauma, and involved a number of different techniques of the types you outlined. And then they randomized to two groups, one group who had this psychological debriefing when they were in hospital, another group who did not, had a control intervention. And at 3 years, what they found was the opposite of what the psychologists like myself had hoped. Worse general psychiatric symptoms, poorer overall functioning, even more financial problems in the group who had the treatment compared to the no treatment group. And those who at the beginning, a minority of people who had that you've identified, George, who had high intrusion and avoidance symptoms, that is, horrible images and thoughts coming into their mind involuntarily and avoiding going out or avoiding driving. Those who had high levels of these symptoms at the beginning, if they got the psychological debriefing, the symptoms stayed high for the 3 years. Whereas those who had high levels of these symptoms at the beginning and did not have any treatment, these symptoms declined. So the conclusion was psychological debriefing is harmful and should be ceased, and it did. And that's what science is about. And I want to try and, if you like, draw some more general lesson from this in a moment. But first of all, I want to talk about a second factor, which is looking for compensation or seeking compensation after an accident, which is perfectly understandable and a natural thing to do. But what there's a number of meta-analyses have shown, particularly in domains like whiplash injury, that actually being involved in the whole legal process and everything that's involved in compensation seeking leads to worse outcomes for people. It seems to be psychologically not very healthy to be engaging in that process in terms of the response to the traumatic emotional reactions to the injury. And thirdly, the question of anger and feeling of angry after an accident. And of course, certain categories of traumatic events, there are collective responses to these that maybe foster anger, people saying this is outrageous that this happened to you, and kindling, if you like, understandable anger in the people who have suffered these events. And but what we know is that if you have suffered a traumatic injury and you've suffered a traumatic response to that, if you feel angry about what has happened to you, your symptoms not only don't decline. They tend to worsen over time. And that may be because the symptoms of anger are very, very similar to those of anxiety. And anxiety, and so that means you're doubling the internal adverse emotional events. When you're anxious, you're angry, and when you're angry, you're anxious. And the thing is, all emotions all have an evolutionary purpose. So the purpose of anxiety is to get us out of danger. Purpose of disgust is to stop us being poisoned. The purpose of depression is to solicit care and nurturance from other people. And the purpose of anger, well, what's the purpose of anger? The purpose of anger is as a negotiation tool. When you see two dogs facing up to each other, they seldom tear each other's throats out. Usually the dog with the biggest growl results in the other dog backing off. So the growl is the anger signal that gives them an edge in the negotiation. And that's true in humans as well. Anger is a way of getting your way. And of course, there are different views on anger. Maya Angelou, the American poet, great American poet, said that anger burns the vessel clean. It's a purifying emotion. Mark Twain says anger corrodes the vessel that holds it. Now, who was right? Well, Aristotle, many thousands of years before, came up with the right answer. He said, anger is easy to have, but to be angry at the right person for the right reason, expressed in the right way, is much more difficult. So for anger to become a cleansing emotion, as Maya Angelou said, it has to be, you have to know what you're requesting of the person or group. You have to know to whom the anger is addressed, and you have to know specifically what you want them to do or not do. And once you do that, then anger neuropsychologically becomes an empowering emotion as opposed to a disabling one that kindles anxiety. So what are these three disparate domains? What could be a common factor that bears on one of your George's, Professor Bonanno's third element of his theory, the regulatory flexibility? Well, one possible candidate is attention. Attention is a feature particularly of the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex is really the source of our behavioral adaptability and flexibility. It's where we assess context. It's where we process feedback. And it's the part of the brain that really is the gateway to our emotions. So what I'm suggesting is with for example, the psychological debriefing, what you're doing is you're directing people's attention to internal states, possibly in a way that kindles and fosters these states, as opposed to them evolving or developing in a way that might be quite different if attention is not devoted to them. Similarly, in compensation, which is perfectly understandable that people look for compensation for their injuries, but in the process of doing so, they have to focus their attention. They have to repeatedly report their symptoms. They have to be assessed by people. They're thinking about it all the time, and therefore their attention is focused internally. And thirdly, with anger, of course, if you have an orientation to the world where you say things to yourself, if Jed had said to himself, "It's not fair what happened to me. It's not fair." That is that cognitive stance against the world. It's unjust what's happened to me. So that feeling of injustice is understandable, but it doesn't fit Aristotle's recipe. It's more a Mark Twain response, because you're feeling unjust. There's injustice in the world or in an amorphous group, but you don't know specifically what you want of what person or group to happen. And so I just offer this attentional candidate as a possible contributor to this unexplained variance. Now, I just wonder to what extent we are risking having gone from, in my childhood, a culture that said, don't pay attention to your internal states. Don't pay attention to your emotions. Pull yourself together, be a man, okay? And people suffered awful repression and suppression of their emotions and didn't had to hide awful, unpleasant experiences. That kind of old, Second World War, I guess, and shortly after, macho kind of approach to emotions, although women had to do it as well. Then we move into the rise of largely American psychology in the 1950s and 60s and the psychotherapy revolution, where suddenly we're really encouraged to look inside, to examine ourselves, and to focus hugely our attention inside ourselves. And now, of course, we have the adding to that, the multiplication of diagnoses, of people categorizing themselves according to internal states to do with their behaviors or their attention, etc., which has come to the point with Diagnostic and Statistical Manual 5, where I guess no one in this room could escape at least one or two diagnoses. Certainly, I've got several. So the risk here is that having gone from one undesirable, pay no attention to the internal state, this psychology is all nonsense, to one where we're overemphasizing and over-focusing attention in internal states, the risk is that we are maybe undermining resilience and creating vulnerabilities, which are particularly in young people, and particularly, I have to say, with the effects of social media on attention, the effects of technology on attention, there's good evidence, attention capacity is shrinking. And so if your attention capacity is shrinking, your regulatory flexibility will be impaired, I assure you. And so, the diagnostic overreach is a risk combined with this loss of attention we're having with technology. So I would just like to finish off and thank you, Professor Bonanno, for a fantastic presentation, and thank you all very much.
Thank you both very much. That's fantastic. I invite you now to come back on stage and to field some questions. We have a terrific audience this evening, so